All right,
Hey, I'm
let's
spoken
shift
truth.
gears. I've got a little update on the voice to Parliament. Yesterday, I worked from midday till 9 p.m. creating a video, which I'm going to put out later today. I was writing scripts and editing and stuff, and I'm going to put it out. So this was a full-page ad in one of Australia's biggest newspaper yesterday. It says, "Don't worry, sweetheart. It's just shareholders' money." And Katie Chaney is a Teal MP. These greeny leftists, the worst types of parliamentary people that we have, but they're elected, so they're entitled to be there. And Michael Chaney is the chairman of Wesfarmers, and Wesfarmers is one of the biggest companies here in Australia, and he's handing off the money to Thomas Mayo, who's wearing his communist t-shirt. And man, oh my God, the people on the left in the Yes campaign, their heads just exploded, man. You could hear them exploding. I could hear it in the distance, man. It was like thunder on the horizon. That was the leftist greenies' heads exploding from this newspaper ad, and a bit of satire and a bit of fun that's in there. Thomas Mayo's the guy who came out, and he's the architect of the voice, saying that, we need a voice to Parliament, we need this. But in the same breath, he's saying, we want to thank our communist forefathers. Like, what the fuck are you talking about, mate? And he's out there saying that this is going to be the revolution that we need. It's going to save Australia. It's going to be this. It's going to be that. But he doesn't realise that all he's doing is further dividing Australia. And I figured out something. I unpicked Linda Burney's speech yesterday. That was the video that I was creating, which I'll put out later today. And so Linda Burney's the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and she seems like a really nice lady. She's very charismatic, as most politicians are, and she's got a deep-seated belief and will to help in the Indigenous population. But when you pull back the curtain, and here's the unspoken truth about the voice, we have huge bureaucracy here in Australia about Indigenous population, and most countries do. Most Western countries have some element of guilt about the past, and there's the sins of the father that need to be absolved by the current generation, even though nobody alive today was responsible for anything that happened. And the people that are in the Indigenous population were not on the receiving end of any of that anyway. It doesn't make any sense. But I put into ChatGPT, and I was looking because I couldn't find the statistics clearly. And she's saying that we need a voice to Parliament because nobody's been listening. And I'm like, what are you talking about? No one's listening, man. Don't they spend $4 billion a year on these types of things? I asked ChatGPT, I asked Google, and I look, and over the last 20 years, on average, they've spent $3.6 billion per year on these specific things and related to the voice to Parliament. And we all agree, this is the irony in all of that, right? So she's saying, we need a voice to Parliament because no one's listening. And I'm like, $4 billion a year says that people are listening, and the government is listening. They're listening, but it's not working. And both sides of politics agree that whatever they've tried doesn't work. And here's where I arrived, Ed. And it's actually a pretty big sort of revelation when you think about it. So think, if you were going to use $4 billion and you're going to distribute that across only 3.7% of the Australian population, and you're trying to do a series of things to close the gap to help, Indigenous lifespan is much lower than everybody else in the population. They have these health issues. They have alcohol problems, drug problems, mental health problems. They have all of these problems, right? And the government is trying to solve these problems to close the gap to give them a better opportunity. Essentially, what they're doing is it's a socialist policy. So all of these people that like socialism and greeny stuff and communism and all of that, right here in Australia, in the last 20 years, in the last 50 years in Australia, none of the socialist policies of our government have worked. And we both admit, both sides of politics admit that it hasn't worked. And it hasn't. Because what they're trying to do is to solve endemic problems in society on a case-by-case basis with money and policy. And one of the things that she raises so I'll give you an example, and I'll close out with this because it's a whole video that I've got, and I spent a lot of time debunking what she's saying. So she says that one of the things that we're going to do with the voice to Parliament is we're going to close the gap properly on health, on education, on housing, and on jobs. But each one of those things is completely and totally related to personal responsibility. So she says that it's something like there's a large percentage of the Indigenous population, kids, that don't finish high school. And she's insinuating that the voice to parliament is going to be able to keep more kids in school. And we do know that if you stay at school, you're more likely to be successful, right? You might go to university, you're more likely to get a better job. There's a whole bunch of reasons why. We already know that. So that's a good thing. And so her intention is fantastic, right? I like her intention. It's great. I like the idea of her trying to solve the problem of kids going to school. But she talks about truancy and kids not actually going to school because they don't like school. And then she says, we're going to use the voice to parliament to consult with the local community, and we're going to figure out ways to solve the problem of truancy. So the voice to parliament is going to be talking about Indigenous kids that don't want to go to school, and they're going to try and create a government policy, meaning using the voice to parliament, where they make recommendations to the government and go, hey, maybe you should make legislation about keeping kids in school, and this is what we can do. And the legislators, the senators and the House of Representative people go, yeah, that's a good idea. We should keep kids at school. But here's the thing. Every single school on planet Earth already has a truancy policy. And no government on planet Earth can get a 14-year-old kid out of bed at 8 o'clock in the morning, get them breakfast, get them into their school uniform, kick them up the arse and get them on the school bus and get them to school. And even if you could do that, they get to school and they go, oh, fuck this place. And they fucking walk out the front gate and go somewhere else. She thinks, and she's insinuating, that the voice to parliament is going to solve the problem of school truancy for Indigenous children. And I'm like, these are socialist policies that haven't currently worked, and you're agreeing that they haven't worked. Both sides of politics are agreeing they haven't worked. Now you're going to introduce another layer of bureaucracy that's going to talk to more people, and then you're going to introduce some other policy that's going to try. So maybe you've got a fresh idea. Maybe you've got a new way of doing it. Okay, cool. Maybe there's a different way. Maybe there's a better way. We haven't tried it before. Maybe we haven't done any of that stuff. Maybe we should try that. Okay, cool. But the reality is it's still a socialist policy because you're still coming from the top down of government trying to fix an individual's problem about school. You can't decide if a kid wants to go to school or not. You can't get their parents. You can't get the school to force them to go to school. There's another one that she talks about in her speech. And this is like the self-destruct button, this speech, by the way, because she's trying to use guilt and shame. And one of the things that she talks about is how the suicide rate of the Indigenous population is much greater than everybody else, whoever that is. Compared to what? Like, she doesn't even say. She just said, we're 54 or 27 times more likely to, have suicidal problems or whatever it is, right? So she's talking about these alarming statistics, and you hear the statistic and you go, whew, that's bad. But here's the thing. I don't feel any guilt or any shame about that. I feel a little bit of empathy for somebody's mental health problem, but the government is not going to be able to solve the higher rates of suicide amongst the Indigenous population compared to some other hypothetical number that she's talking about, because the government can't solve what's going on in somebody's mind. If someone is feeling depressed and they're feeling down and they've got suicidal thoughts or they're thinking about harming themselves, the government can't stop that. But she's insinuating that the voice to parliament can stop that. But it hasn't stopped it till now. And literally hundreds of billions of dollars haven't been able to close the gap or solve those problems. And then she wants to add a voice to parliament, which is going to create more bureaucracy. And all you're doing is you're two sides of the same coin. It's not currently working, and now you're going to introduce a level of bureaucracy and try slightly different things, maybe better things. I agree that maybe that's a good idea. You should try different things and things you've never done before. But it's still not going to work because fundamentally it's a socialist policy. And where I arrived, Ed, you'll laugh at this and you'll find this a little bit amusing, because I was thinking, where in the world has this been tried before? Because these socialists and these communists, they don't realize that they're socialists and they're communists. That's the thing. Because if I said to them, this is a stupid commie idea, they'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm not a communist. What are you talking about? Because they've never read a communist book. No. They've never read the manifesto. They've never read the Gulag Archipelago. They just don't realize what it is that they're doing. Go ahead. You're going to say something?
Well, that's because they're poorly educated themselves.
Correct. Yeah, correct. So I was thinking, where is some ideas where this has happened before and they tried to do this before? And the only thing that I could think of was the Great Leap Forward. And when you look at Mao Zedong, he won the Civil War, and now he's trying to take the Great Leap Forward. Mao Zedong wanted China to come out of poverty and make everything better. And so in a communist society, they have centralized controllers, and the centralized controllers say that this is how things should be, because we know better than all of you put together, because we're a bunch of intellectuals, we're really educated, we have practical experience, we're in the real world. And so this is exactly what they're saying about the voice to parliament. We're gonna appoint, I think it's 27 people that are a cross-section of society. We're gonna use diversity and equity. There'll be old people, young people, there'll be boys, there'll be girls, and it will be an equal representation of everybody in Aboriginal society to be able to come together to implement these things. So it's exactly the same as what they did in communist China. And I'm not saying that these people are communists. I'm not saying that at all, not for a second. But the idea of what they're trying to do has been tried before. Let me just read you a little passage. So the Great Leap Forward was launched in 1958 as an ambitious economic and social campaign to rapidly transform China from an agrarian economy into an industrialized socialist society. So you could argue and remove the words Great Leap Forward and say voice to parliament, and you're saying that the idea was to rapidly transform or to close the gap, to use Australian words, from where they are to where they want to be. So if I go on a little bit further, it says the policy had disastrous consequences. The implementation, so what they did is the implementation of the communes disrupted traditional agriculture practices and caused widespread chaos. Peasants were forced to abandon their small-scale plots to work in large collective farms, often leaving insufficient time and resources for cultivating personal plots. The centralised planning and production targets imposed by the government led to unrealistic goals, exaggerated reporting, and misallocation of resources. So what had happened as a result of that, the collectivised policy disrupted the existing social fabric of rural communities. Traditional social bonds and networks were weakened as peasants were forcibly relocated and their land redistributed. So that sounds a lot like native title to me. It sounds a lot like a treaty to me. It sounds a lot like we're going there. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And a lot of what the policies are that they're describing and how they're trying to do it has very, very clear parallels to Mao's Great Leap Forward as it relates to agriculture. And if I close out about it, the two socialist policies of the Great Leap Forward and the agricultural collectivization highlighted the detrimental consequences of top-down, centrally planned approaches to agriculture. The forced collectivization and disregard for individual incentives led to agricultural failures, economic hardship, and a widespread human suffering. And if you remember the story, there was a famine. Yeah. So the Chinese government, the Chinese collective hive mind of communists who thought that they knew better in the farming practices, forced the farmers to dig down this deep and plant there and water this much. And they controlled every little nuance of society to do that. And they created a famine. And as a result of the Great Leap Forward and the farming collectivization that that's talking about there, 45 million people perished. 45 million people perished. Now, I'm not saying anybody is going to die in this as a result of the voice to parliament. I'm not suggesting that, not for a second, not for a minute. But what I am saying is that the parallels are exactly the same. And it doesn't matter if there's a voice to parliament or there's the current system that we currently have. You have a top-down approach that is not working. It doesn't work. But if you have the voice to parliament that takes a bottom-up, grassroots approach, that's also not going to work because you're still the top-down bureaucracy implementing what you're telling me to do from the bottom up, whether or the top down. It doesn't matter. Neither way will work because what you're doing is using socialist policies, and the socialist policies are the things that don't work, not your ability to not listen to the people in charge. It's the socialist policies that don't work. And I'm looking at this going, none of these people have read the Gulag Archipelago. They haven't read this. They don't know about Mao. They don't know about Cuba. They don't know about Vietnam. They don't know about China. How can they not know this shit, man? How can they not know about the Soviet Union? How can they not know about the Chinese Great Leap Forward? It just fucking boggles my mind, man.
Well, they either don't know about it because they're poorly educated themselves, or they don't care because they're blinded by their ideology. They're power hungry. They want the power. They want to be able to control and dictate the way you live your life. This is where capitalism can solve all these problems. Capitalism will solve almost every problem